We made it happen. Jimmy was an incredible success. I don't know where he is. I got to find him. Gosh, I don't. Oh.
Oh yeah, George. Oh, George.
Right
George.
here. Yeah.
We did it, brother.
Yes, we
hey,
did.
Thanks to Dan. You know what? And in the ring with Dan and Benny. Hey, brother, man, hey, he's about the most cat. I just love him to death. I love you. Thanks for having me. Hey, you're the best. I'm telling you, brother. In the ring with
Dan and Benny.
Yeah.
We love you. Thank you so much.
Dan.
Mwah.
Oh yeah.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Dan and Benny in the Ring. I'm Dan Spasciano, joined as always by the player himself, Benny Scala. Benny, how you doing, buddy?
Well, Dan, first things first. I need to pay you homage and acknowledge you for your dominating performance in the 30 last Thursday night. Not only did you win and are now the reigning, defending, undisputed champion, but you also set a points record which may never be broken. You know, the last time I saw such utter domination was on the Seinfeld episode where Kramer ran roughshod in his martial arts class. He thoroughly shellacked all the 9-year-olds at the Kenpo Karate dojo.
Right. Yes. Well, it was a lot of fun, and hopefully I can keep the title for a little while.
Yeah.
But
I know Joe's
think
gunning for you.
I think that's going to end up there with your DiMaggio's hit streak and Brady's ring count, Nolan Ryan's strike numbers. That'll be one of those records our grandkids will be talking about one day. Someone will break. But you know what, Benny? But we mentioned in the past what they say. What's old is new again, and we have an old friend joining us. Why don't you tell everybody who the third face with us this evening is?
Yeah, well, Dan, I think we actually may need to change our name to Dan and Benny and sometimes George in the ring. Even though our guest has been with us many times, we just never seem to run out of stuff to talk about, leading to his invariable return engagement. So our guest is an accomplished author, speaker, and wrestling historian. More important than any of that, he's become a really good friend of ours. So I'm honored to once again introduce our esteemed guest, Mr. George Schire. George, welcome back to Dan and Benny in the Ring.
Hey, Benny, Dan, I love being on your show. I love being on all the podcasts I do. People say, who's your favorite podcast? I've got a lot of them, and if I do them, they're my favorite. How's that sound? And you guys love me for having me on. And yes, we are friends. We are friends.
It's always fun having you on. And, George, I know you're trying to be diplomatic to your fans and the other people you work with, but you can be honest and tell everyone that we're your favorite podcast. It's okay.
We won't tell anybody.
Right. We'll keep it just between you and me, or me and Benny.
Okay. Let's put it
and the
this
folks in Ireland who like
the podcast I'm on is the one that's my favorite at the time.
There you go.
Okay.
How's that?
It's like in the movie Fast Times
I
at Ridgemont High. You ever see that movie, George?
Which one?
Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
I did a long time ago.
Yeah, Damone. His line is, "Wherever you are, that's the place to be." So
that's exactly
whatever
right.
podcast you're on, your favorite one.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it's funny you bring that up because I was just telling my wife about half hour ago. I said, I've done a lot of podcasts the last 2, 3, 4 years, and a lot of them over the last decade or more. But I said, I've been doing a lot of them. And I said, I guess if they keep asking me back, it's okay. Because they could say, well, we're not going to have that guy on again, but
right.
It's fun. And
Absolutely.
You guys, you do a good show. And honestly, this is the compliment. I do a lot of podcasts with different folks. And there are some that I don't do and I turn down. And I have said I'm not going to do it. So let that be the compliment. You guys are doing a good job because I enjoy doing it.
Thank you.
I like it. And I noticed a quick compliment to you, George. Your background there, a lot more festive than the last time you were with us. So
well, I just turned off the lights and said, let the Christmas tree as it is look nice.
Well, for those will be watching us on YouTube, our audio listeners don't have to worry about this. I apologize for my background. I haven't put the tubs of all my Christmas decorations back in the attic yet, so I'm about 5% of how ruined Dave Meltzer's office looked when he did Dark Side of the Ring. I'm still dumbfounded that he willingly let someone photograph that room, but it's not take a man.
And this isn't to knock anybody, because everybody has their own style and way of doing things. But I have been over my decades in some, let's just say, wrestling rooms, if you want to call them that. I've been in some where I have no idea how they find a darn thing. And I'm serious. I have no clue, because there's no rhyme, there's no reason, nothing's put away, piles here, piles there, some of the collection here, some of the collection there, you know, and my style doesn't allow that. I want you guys to make a trip to Minnesota, because I only let wrestling friends come in, and you can come into my wrestling room. And when you do, you're going to say, do you ever come in here? Do you ever do anything in here? And I'm in there every day, and I'm working. Yeah. Everything is put away and neat.
Funny you say that, George. I'm going to be there in 11 days.
You are?
Yes, sir.
There, mean here in Minnesota, St. Paul?
Yes, sir. The 23rd through the 30th. Yes, sir.
23rd through the 30th. You're going to be here over Christmas?
Yes, sir.
Where are you staying? What are you doing?
In Minneapolis with my son and my grandkids.
Well, you got to make room you got to make a few minutes to say we're going to get together for coffee and come over.
We have to do that. Yes, sir. We will do that.
You know, I have my daughters will tease me because they made me a plaque that's above the door of my wrestling room, little tiny plaque. And it legitimately says maximum occupancy 1.
There you go.
Because I don't let anybody in there. It's when you come, you can see it. It's above the door. They say, so Dad, you never let anybody in there.
The fire marshal won't knock on the door if I'm in there. Like
when we lived in our old house, and this is 30 years ago now. My girls, our daughters, they were still growing up, and my wrestling area consisted of a half of the basement at that time in our house, and the girls would have their girlfriends over, their kid friends to play in the basement. They had their stuff all over. I never told them. I never said a word. And they would say, now, when you come over here, you don't go past this line right here. They had the imaginary line that nobody would go into there. I never told them this. They just respected it. Nice. So it's kind of a running joke that you don't go into Dad's room.
There you go.
So. Got the George Schire cave has the same security as Castle Cornet, apparently.
Right.
Jim Cornette, you know, I know he's probably heard this a million times when I say this, but he and I have the same birthday. We're 10 years apart, though. He was born 61. He was born 61. I was born 51.
Okay.
And I can imagine if he's a Virgo like me and on the same birthday, and after seeing that book that he put out on the Midnight Express, I don't know if you guys have it. Oh my God, I love that book. I can imagine that Jimmy is pretty fun and organized. I think it would be fun. And he was a fan. You know, that was the thing. He was a fan. He and I mean, this goes back a lot of years, but he and I used to trade wrestling programs when he was still a photographer going around. He was one of my program correspondents that I had back in the 80s and earlier.
I know he's mentioned a few times on the show the program and tape traders and stuff he used to do when he was younger. So
yeah. Okay, let's do a show. I think we're doing a show, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We get so that's one of the reasons we love having you on, George. We get so
Benny, you and I we're gonna talk off air or whatever, and we're gonna get you set up for a visit.
Yes, sir. You got
it. There you go. All right. Well, you know, I mean, we've had you on so many times. I guess we can skip the preliminaries and get right to the main event, as they say. I want to get your thoughts on some recent news. Obviously, it was all over the sphere, and now it's been brought up more with his television time on the other channel. But CM Punk was recently terminated from AEW, resulting in a backstage altercation with Jungle Boy Jack Perry after Jack Perry went into business for himself during a pre-show of their big Wembley pay-per-view, made some comments, related to CM Punk kicking him out over broken glass. And they got into a scuffle backstage. Tony Khan, remember, he made the speech where he said he feared for his life and his safety. And I wanted your thoughts on this, because you think about like a random, AWA star back in the day, like, Evan Johnson. I mean, what would have happened to him if he had gone into, gone into business for himself and cut a promo on Bockwinkel or Gagne at a live show? I mean, how would that have flown back then?
Well, I think the simple answer is it would have, after that interview going into business for himself, it would have been Evan who?
Right.
Okay. Because, yes, it was a different era, but the guy, let's take this though. None of the guys were ever scripted in my era.
Right.
You know, in kayfabe, we've all talked about how when they would do an interview on TV, they were given a line from the announcer, they took it and ran 2 minutes and got you to come and see him at the arena. But if something like that would have happened, I can just guarantee you, and knowing Vern Gagne and probably any other promoter in any other territory that was around, Evan Johnson would have done it, but he would have been gone so fast from the arena and never heard of again. I mean, he might have been buried in somebody's car forever. It's just the fact.
Yeah. Would somebody have been waiting, like one of the wrestlers been waiting backstage to clean his clock first?
I don't know about that, but there'd be somebody there yanking him out of the auditorium. He'd be done. It's just that simple. Whatever his beef would have been, or however like you say, he went off on Bockwinkel and did a shoot interview or something. It wouldn't have went over in the old school days. It just wouldn't. He would have been gone. Right or wrong, it would have been gone. He would have been gone. And the thing is, now, I confess, guys, I have not heard the incidents or watched the incident that you talk about with CM Punk and Jungle Boy, but I get the whole premise of the thing. You do not go out and, as they say, go into business for yourself. And when a wrestler would do that in the territory days, they were gone. And in some cases, they could, I'd like to use the word blacklisted, but in some cases, because of the promoters, as the closeness they had with one another and respected each other's territories, etc. Mm-hmm. Vern Gagne, he was the boss, the AWA, and if Evan Johnson would have done that, and Evan, if you're listening to this, we're just using his example. You're a good guy.
Just hypothetical.
Yeah, hypothetical. But Vern would have he'd have been gone from Vern Gagne. You'd have never heard from him again. And chances are he wouldn't have wrestled for Eddie Graham or Vince McMahon Sr. or Sam Muchnick or anybody ever again. It just wouldn't have happened. So,
kind of expand a little bit to your thoughts. I think what makes it interesting, and Benny and I have talked about it on the show before, is in AEW, Jack Perry, for all his being hyped as one of what they called a pillar of the company, he never got above the low mid card. He was never taken seriously as a main eventer. He did have a title match, but it was one of those, Vern Gagne is defending the title against, random tag team guy number 6, where, yeah, it might be a good match, but he's not losing the belt. So I think that kind of added fuel to the fire, that it was such a guy so low on the totem pole that was the catalyst for the company losing its biggest star, who has since gone to WWE. And as of WrestleNomics just reported the other day, CM Punk's now the #1 merch seller in December for WWE. So he's already paying dividends. And it's like, I guess, would it have been different if it had been a bigger name back then that had gone into business on Bockwinkel or Gagne, or take the Northeast and somebody goes against San Martino? If it's a big name, if it had been Ken Patera, if it had been Bockwinkel going into business for himself against Gagne, is it the same thing, or what am I trying to say? Is the standard higher? Like, if you're a main event guy, you should know better, and I'm going to punish you twice the way I would if it was Jabroni number 7.
Well, I think what you have to look at, and let's use Bockwinkel for an example. Now, we know he was on top for how many years, and he was the main event, and Vern and him were behind the scenes. They were buddies. Vern trusted him. Nick worked for Vern. He trusted Vern. Whatever Vern asked him to do, Nick did. Nick was never a guy that complained about his position or where he was. Now, I'm not saying he wouldn't have complained if his income dropped or things like that happened. But just as a side note to that was the beauty of the territory days then. Because when a wrestler was disgruntled with where they were on the card, or what they were being paid or not paid, or what their push was, they could voice their opinion, leave town, go to another area. Right. They always had an income. So in the case of Nick, that would be different, because if, let's say, Vern, for 3 years, Nick's on top, and all of a sudden Nick has something go crazy, and he wants to take off on Vern Gagne for something. I don't know if Vern and him would have duked it out behind the scenes and, threatened to leave, get rid of him or whatever. But it definitely would be the case more of a lower end wrestler who, for whatever reason, just isn't happy with whatever's going on with the promotion, their push, and where they are. I give you this, and this is kind of off key. You guys have heard of Crazy Luke Graham?
Oh, absolutely.
One of the famous Graham brothers, not real brothers, we know, but one of the Grahams. Well, if you looked back in the 60s, Crazy Luke was big in New York. He worked with Jerry. He had some matches up there when Eddie would come up from Florida finally, and he worked with Jerry. He even got good pushes against various guys. I know he had a match or two with Bruno.
He did.
He got a good push. Yep, he got a good push. Later on, he was a tag team champion with Tarzan Tyler.
Correct.
If you looked out on the West Coast, Crazy Luke Graham had a great push out there. He was always top tier. He was even their WWA champion for a while, their version of the world champion in Los Angeles. So as a fan back then, I'm looking at Crazy Luke Graham. I only get to see him in the magazines. And this guy's good. I'd like to see him. Well, in 1969, 68, 69, we're getting Crazy Luke in the AWA. As a side note, let me say this. You guys ever hear of Buster Guillotine Gordon?
He was his tag team partner up north when I watched.
Okay, Buster Gordon, we had this big spread in our Minneapolis program. Coming soon, Buster Gordon. They called him, you pronounce it Guillotine, right?
Guillotine, right, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Guillotine Gordon, and he was going to come. And I had heard about him. I thought, well, we're getting a new guy. Every fall, you'd get one or two new faces coming through, And we were excited. Then the next program, they had another clip, Guillotine Gordon's looking over foes here, wants to, meet the top. Well, the night of his match that allegedly he was going to be on the card, he never showed. There was no explanation, zero. No. But who came out was Crazy Luke Graham. And he was never announced as coming in at all. But that was his substitute. Well, here's where the Crazy Luke story goes. So I see him getting these pushes all over. And that night, Crazy Luke, I don't remember who he wrestled. And when he was here, he wrestled all of our top guys. Pepper Gomez, Red Bastien, Billy Red Lyons, Cowboy Bill Watts, whoever was in the territory in 69. Crazy Luke, Edward Carpentier, he wrestled them all. But he was always mid-card. He did get a title match with Vern. But bottom line is, if you looked at it from what you saw him doing on the West Coast and the East Coast, he was a disappointment because when he'd go against Gomez or Bastien or whoever, he lost. He just lost. Right. So I always wondered, well, geez, was, back when I was still a kid in 69, I'm, 18 years old, thought, this is weird. Well, I had a chance at Cauliflower Alley, and this would have been early 2000s. Crazy Luke was there. He and I sat on one of the couches in the room there for a while, and I talked to him. I told him I remembered him there, and I had him sign a picture for me, and we chatted. And I asked him, I said, how was it working for Vern when you came in? And I said, I was disappointed because you didn't seem to get any of the real top tier matches. I actually said that to him. He told me, he said, I got paid well from Vern. For the year I was there, he said, I enjoyed the territory. He said, I got paid well. So that kind of answers your question, that here was a guy who wasn't getting the push he was in other territories. He wasn't a champion. He wasn't a contender. But he was paid, whatever he was paid, it was paid well. Maybe it was more than he was making in the other. We don't know. But he said he was paid well. That's a compliment. And I think that was the deal with most of these guys. When that's the way the territorial system was so successful, because a lot of times when a guy left the territory, any territory, it was because he wasn't satisfied with his push, or maybe there was a disagreement on the income, or he wanted more. He didn't like wrestling a certain guy, whatever it was. And when that happened, they just moved on. It was so easy. Unfortunately, as the business advanced to what it is today, and has been for the last, right now, guys, 40 years ago this month, right now, December, is when Hulk Hogan was pulled from the AWA to go to the WWF. We're 40th anniversary, 1983. Wow. And when you see how the business has changed in the last 40 years, but we all know now that if you don't work for the WWE, and if you don't work for AEW, which is still, pretty much a contender, and maybe one or two somewhat bigger, you don't work unless you're in some gymnasium making $20. You don't work.
Right.
And so that's, I think with the case that we're talking about, if an Evan Johnson or somebody went into business for themselves, in that day, it would have been highly unlikely. And here's the other thing, and this, I don't know if this goes with it or not, but the territories back then were set up so that each guy was different in how they looked or what they were perceived to be as far as their character goes, obviously heel or baby. But it was crazy enough where Vern Gagne would not have two guys that had the same hold, like a finishing hold. They couldn't use the same hold. So a good example of that is Johnny Powers. Johnny Powers was working here in 1967. He had his leg lock, figure four leg lock. He called it the power lock.
Power lock.
It was a figure four. It was a figure four. Well, Johnny was here for almost a year. He got a great push. Dick Beyer came in August of 67, about a year after Johnny had come in, and Vern told Johnny he didn't want him to use the power lock anymore. That was where the point of contention came, because Johnny said, "The hell with you, that's my finishing hold. I'm Johnny Powerlock Powers." That's what he was billed as. But Vern wanted Dick Beyer, Dr. X. He wanted him to be able to use his figure four leg lock. Now, whether that's fair or not, but we also had Reggie Parks, who was here right before Johnny Powers. And Reggie was a babyface, but he used the figure four leg lock as his finishing hold. When Powers was here and Parks was on some of the cards, Parks didn't use the figure four. So it was crazy enough like that each wrestler had to be different. And that was one of the reasons that Powers left. He just said, screw you, pretty much. And Powers went on to great success. I mean, he was involved in his own promotion, the IWA. Wasn't that Eddie Einhorn involved with them? Or
yes.
Yeah. And, he had Johnny Ballantyne and the Mongols and everybody working for him. Igor, Bulldog Brower. He had a great group. Right. So it didn't hurt him. But if he got into contention now and went on TV and said, "Hey, Vern Gagne told me I can't use the figure four, and I'm going to do what I want because I want to make the big money, and I'm going to cripple as many guys as I can," and blah, 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 blah. Well, it wouldn't have happened because it was all done behind the scenes.
Right. I gotcha.
Does that answer the question?
It sure does. George, kind of a follow-up question to that. Included in Punk's termination, they had a hearing, rather, for Punk's termination, and one of the members on the committee was Bryan Danielson, Daniel Bryan. I've never heard of that before, where a promotion would use one of the workers to determine the fate of another worker. I mean, one, is that like unprecedented? Would Vern have ever done that? And two, isn't that a conflict of interest? Because obviously Punk's making more money than Bryan. Punk probably had a more coveted spot. I mean, how could somebody like Daniel Bryan remain totally objective?
Well, I'm guessing he wasn't, but I'm guessing he was also in on it as far as the disciplinary action as you refer to it. Again, I don't know if this would be a proper analogy to it, because I'm thinking as I'm trying to listen to your question. But we bring this up once in a while, and it's always fun to do. The famous Vern Gagne telling Stan Hansen he's going to drop the title to Nick Bockwinkel in Denver that one night. in 86 and, or 86. Yeah, it was 86. And Stan was going to go off to Japan for his regular tour. And he told Vern, I'm not dropping it tonight. The only one that was in on that besides Vern was Nick. Nick knew that he was going over that night. And that may have been a mistake on Vern's part, because he probably should have let his champion in on it. That, when you come to Denver tonight, I want you to drop the title. But he didn't. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter in hindsight. But Stan didn't go for it. He said, no, I'm not dropping it. I'm going over to Japan. I'm advertised as AWA champ. And I'm going over there and I'm not dropping it. And, him and Vern, they kind of got to a little push and shove, but Stan grabbed the belt and left. We know the famous story. And of course, Vern's left holding the bag because now he had to go out to the audience and tell the fans. And he told the truth. He said, the champion left the building, refused to defend the title to Nick Bockwinkel. And by default, because the challenger, the champion refused, Nick is champ. So that's kind of going into business for yourself. And Nick would have been the guy on Vern's side at that point. Does that make sense that it's kind of a similar situation?
Yeah, no, we get it.
And I mean, later on, let's point out, Nick, because he was asked about this, he said again, I worked for Vern Gagne. See, and I think that's the key. I think, and maybe because I'm really, really old school in life as well as wrestling, I believe that when you go to work for an employer, you do what they ask you to do. You do what they're paying you to do. If you don't like it, you don't agree with it, you always have the right to go and get another job or leave, unless they're asking you to do something that's illegal. But otherwise, you're working for them. And whatever they ask you to do, you do it because they're your boss. And I think, love Stan Hansen. I love Bruiser Brody. Those guys were so good, but they pulled that crap. Whether you want to agree with it or not, they pulled that crap on so many promoters where we're not going to do what you want us to do. I don't know. I never worked for anybody where I could come in and tell my boss, no, I'm not going to do that and still keep my job. And you guys know I worked in a bank for 35 years.
Right.
I had a lot of bosses. I had a lot of things in the bank. There were times when you go, what the hell are they doing? Why are we doing this? Or what do they want to do that for? But you know what? I used to tell my employees that reported to me, I said, hey, it's not up to us to agree with everything management does. We're here to do the job. And again, if I didn't like it, I could leave. So I think that's where I am with the whole wrestling thing. There were, and with wrestling, as it is in every sport, it is such an ego-driven, and everybody wanting to get the top spot. Everybody's fighting for that same piece of the pie. I think sometimes they get carried away, and they forget that basically we're working for somebody. And I don't know. I think you get a lot more respect and a lot more push in your company, regardless of wrestling or whatever you do. If you are more, I want to say you're the guy that's there to do what they're asking you to do. You're always willing to help out. You're always willing to make it, come together. You're going to get a lot farther than the guy that's always bucking the system.
Right.
And in the case of Stan, that was a weird deal from the start, because we know that Vern only put the title on him because he needed a big name when he was in this fight of his life with the WWF at the time. And Junior was stealing everybody's talent and taking all of Vern's guys. And he needs a big name. Well, Hansen fit the bill, but Vern would never have done that. Vern, I can tell you, I'd bet the farm that Vern would have never put the title on Stan Hansen in a million years if he wouldn't have been in that battle with McMahon. That was
desperation.
Was a different set of circumstances.
Right.
And he needed, Vince McMahon had Hulk Hogan, who was bigger than everything in that time frame. And we needed a big name, and that was Hansen. Bockwinkel, Jack Lanza, they told Vern, don't do it. Don't put it on him. And the whole deal with Hansen was his loyalties. And again, this was his deal to work with. His loyalties were to Shohei Baba, Giant Baba. He worked for Japan over there. He made more money over there. He made better money. And when he'd come home to wrestle for Vern, and he was Vern's champ, that's where I draw the line. And I say, you can have all the devotion you want to Vern or to Baba, but when you come and work on Vern's card, Vern is your boss.
Right.
Baba doesn't exist here. And if that's a problem with you, Stan, then you either do what you did, which was childish, or you leave the company. Just go. So the Daniel Bryan thing, I could still call him Daniel Bryan, but I know who you mean, Bryan Danielson. Obviously, he was brought in, and I'd like to think he was compensated for doing what he did. I don't know. CM Punk, if you guys can help me here, you can educate me.
Mm-hmm.
I know he left WWE a lot of years ago.
Didn't
10, go back,
10.
But it was about 10. Now wasn't wrestling all this time, was he?
Correct. Yeah. No. He had a short stint in the UFC.
Yeah.
And then he came back to AEW about 2 and change years ago.
Yeah.
He had some time off from a foot injury, and then the infamous they called it the brawl out, where he had CM Punk had torn I believe it was his tricep in the title match at a pay-per-view. Okay. Ended up finishing the match, won the title. He was doing the press scrum after the pay-per-view. I mean, still bloody. At that point, he said he knew he was hurt. He knew this was probably it. He's eating some muffins, and he just cut this scathing, unscripted promo about, these people are children, and the management here is terrible because there's some talent. I use talent loosely with some of AEW's locker room, but there's some AEW wrestlers that are EVPs, and they were at the core of his issue. And obviously Tony Khan has no control over his locker room, and he cuts this whole thing. He leaves. There's a fist fight in the locker room. A bunch of people are suspended. He comes back from suspension. They build the entire AEW has a Saturday show called Collision, and they built that around him. That was one of Warner's requirements when they gave them the extra time on the weekend, is CM Punk had to be a mainstay on the show. He ends up, there's a fight in London. He gets fired, came back to the WWE at Survivor Series. He's been on every all but one SmackDown since, and is already a big deal. But yeah, he was off, I'd say about 8 years. He wasn't in wrestling, and then he came back to AEW, had the incident, got fired. Now he's back home, WWE, first time in 10 years, and is already a major star. So,
well, and he's good. I mean, I remember watching him. He's good, but I think some of these guys, it's ego driven, as I said, and I think sometimes they forget that they have bosses, and they do things that And of course, to compare wrestling today, like you mentioned, Warner and TV time. You see, wrestling's a lot different today than the way it was back then, in my day. I mean, you didn't have corporate sponsors. You didn't have anybody paying the bill but the promoter. And usually the TV time, when they had TV back in those days, they paid the TV station to air their hour and a half program. And the TV station was able to get paid and then get a couple little advertisers to go on there, and they were fine with it. It was, just an income thing. Whereas today, the stations, they have all the say in what is played and what isn't played and what they want, and probably who they want pushed. And I mean, so the whole corporate structure is different.
Yeah. No, you're certainly right about that. But speaking of the way things used to be, the ratings today are down really across the board. AEW's been getting hit recently. They had I hate to sound like I'm keep picking on them, but they aired their Saturday show against the Survivor Series and drew 200 and change thousand. It was about 10 times less than what WWE pulled at the same time, or the SmackDown the Friday night before. But the reason I ask is because Raw's getting about 1.5 to 2, SmackDown somewhere between 2 and 3 million, and AEW's hit about their 700 to 800,000 on their primetime show on Wednesday nights. But you compare that to not that long ago, the Monday Night Wars, the highest rated Monday Night Raw in history drew just over an 8 rating, which is 8 million. You had 10, combining that with WCW, you had 10 to 12 million people a week watching wrestling. I have to assume when they say 1.5 million watching Raw and 2 million watching SmackDown, those are roughly the same 1.5 million, 2 million people. So, where did it go? Where did the wrestling fans go when you look at some of these territory shows? All of them high ratings across the board. You're talking 30, 40 million people a week down to 2 to 5. Where did all those wrestling fans go?
Well, the easy answer is they moved on with life. But here's the thing. Wrestling in any era, whether it be my day or current day, it's always been a cyclical product. I can name you times when in the territory days, a territory could be hot for 2 years or 3 years. For whatever reason, they couldn't do anything wrong and they were drawing well, whether it be the wrestler or wrestlers or the programs or the angles, whatever it was. A lot of times it was the angles. One of the things that I learned as a kid, probably someone like me, and we've talked about other guys like me that have been around a million years that followed wrestling. The average wrestling fan over the years, they got attracted to it because there was a wrestler or a couple of their buddies pointed out, you got to watch this guy. This guy's nuts, or this guy's cool, or whatever it was. And during the cycle that wrestler was in the territory, they followed it. And then all of a sudden, other things happen and that guy's no longer here, and then they don't watch for a year. Well, then it's hard to come back, and then they probably never come back. Wrestling has always been that way. We're on, you guys, we're on wrestling Facebook boards. We hear conversations all the time. And I see people writing all the time. Well, I didn't watch wrestling for about 5 years there, and I missed this time period. A lot of it's just life getting in the way. Different things that happen that take you, could be job, could be marriage, could be divorce, it could be sickness, could be you lost interest, something else gained your, and when you talk about those Monday Night Wars, those few years, and I was following those. I was watching those on Monday nights back then. Man, I was flipping back and forth like a nut job here in the house. I was interested. I was still following wrestling to speak of. And the thing was, it was because what's this one going to do? What's he going to do to counter this? Oh my God, I don't believe he did that. Well, now what's he going to do? It was more of that game we were playing, a mental game. And they were interesting. I remember when we had weekly cards or monthly cards, every 2-week cards. Those were usually the generals for any territory you were in. They either ran a weekly, Houston, Texas, every Friday night religiously. You were at the Coliseum in Houston for wrestling. And they had good cards and they drew a lot of people every week. Now, were the same people there every week? No, they had a small base that was a season ticket holder, but the rest of the crowd, they had to draw in. And they had different people that came in. And sometimes they'd come in for a certain wrestler or tag team or whatever it was, and then they'd move on. We just mentioned about the 40 years that the promotional war of all time started when Vince McMahon pulled Hulk Hogan from RAWA, and then he took Gene Okerlund, and he took David Schultz, and then he took Jesse Ventura, and he took, eventually just taking guys just to be mean. And he did this with all the territories. He went and got the Junkyard Dog and the Freebirds and, everybody. Mm-hmm. We were really lucky here. You want to talk about the Monday Night Wars that took place on TV here in the Twin Cities. We were, for the first 3 years this would have been January of 84 to about right about the beginning of '86 when it started to start going sour for the AWA. But we actually had wars because Vern would put on a card and Vince would put on a card. Sometimes they did it on the same night, which was weird because to me, you're kind of cutting your crowd somewhere there.
Right.
Your possible crowd. But they got smart. Vern would do it one night, Vince would do 2 nights later, or vice versa. And for us as a wrestling fan, this was heaven on earth, man. We were getting to see both these cards. But the key was, in those days, one promotion was generally going to eventually win out. In this case, Vince was doing it because he kept taking all the talent from everybody, and no matter what they advertised, the guy didn't show up. And so as time went on, in the beginning, though, Vern was out drawing. And I could show you attendance figures. They'd be in town 2 nights apart. Vern was drawing better, and Vince was using some of Vern's guys. The Hogan and Don Morocco and Jimmy Snuka and all these guys that had been here previously. So, but eventually somebody's going to win. In the case of the promotional war, it was a whole different deal because Vince was hell-bent on winning. His pockets were deep. He wasn't going to lose. And eventually when our promoters all decided we're going to work together, well, they couldn't work together because they all wanted to be boss. They all wanted their guys on top. So they can't get together and work together. And Vince, he just sat back in his easy chair and said, this is fun. I'm going to watch these guys destroy one another. And they did. So with attendance figures, I can tell you that wrestling everywhere is cyclical. If you came into Minneapolis, St. Paul through the 60s, we'll just use the 60s, you could draw really well from October through April. Every card you go, you got, and in the auditoriums in those days, let's make this clear. If you had 10,000 people at the auditorium, you had a sellout. If you had 7,500, that was a good crowd. And if you had a 5,000 or a 4,000, you were average. Over the course of the year, it all leveled out and you drew, whatever the hundreds of thousands of people that you drew in for the year. Mm-hmm. But certain months of the year were better months. Minnesota, during the summer months, from about the 1st of June, the first week in June, through usually the second week, third week in August, if we had a card, it was only one, but we didn't run cards during the summer because nobody goes to them. Minnesota, we only get 2 weeks of summer here.
You got to enjoy that weather while you can, right?
Yeah, they're out on their boats, they're on vacations, they're traveling, TV's not on, the days are longer with, daylight savings time, and they don't go to wrestling. So it's fans are cyclical. And I was a freak of nature because I started watching it and I never quit. I didn't go to wrestling because of certain wrestlers being on I just enjoyed the storylines. I enjoyed going, but a lot of people lose interest. You can pick any sport and find that same thing. People that follow baseball, they don't follow baseball. I mean, yes, there's that group that does. They're diehards. But a lot of fans, the majority of the fans, they go to a couple games a season, and if they do that, that's all they want to do. They're not interested. So I think it's cyclical, and just people have lives that get in the way and they move on with something else. And with wrestling today, I don't know, we're 30, 40 years now into the pay-per-views and all these big spectaculars. How many of those can you have before a lot of people just, I can't do that one and I'm not going to do that one and I'd rather do this, before you know what, the attendance is down. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Yeah,
and I have a
sense.
similar follow-up question, George. So recently WWE announced that they were cutting back on their house shows, actually as a budgetary measure. Now, for old guys like us, house shows were the lifeblood for a hardcore wrestling fan for many, many years. And this is just my take on it, but wrestling is becoming less and less personal. and more of a spectacle. And, you know, part of my initial attraction to wrestling was the ability to attend on a frequent basis. And you just mentioned Houston on Fridays. Memphis, I think, was Mondays. Tampa was Tuesdays at the Homer Hesterly. Do you think the lack of frequency and the lack of, you know, intimacy, you know, because you're not watching these guys on a weekly basis, they get to know you probably after a while. You're sitting in the same seat. Do you think this is one of the reasons why there's fewer fans?
I think so. When you mentioned a couple of real classic places, I mentioned the Coliseum in Houston, and you just mentioned Tampa's Homer Hesterly Armory, National Guard Armory. On a National Guard Armory, I think you can hold maybe 3,000-4,000 people capacity, and that might be stretching it. I don't know. Our armories in the Twin Cities, if we had 3,500 people there, we had the fire marshal getting nervous. So, nice. But that was a sellout. Okay. But again, if you do this every week or every other week, you know, you can do the math and figure out you're doing a pretty good draw for a year. Right. So I think fans today, sometimes there can be too much. Guys, I don't watch today's product, but I do know that they have these spectacular big cards. This one's bigger and better than the last one. How many times can you keep selling that hype before it's no longer believable?
That was one of the criticisms I remember in the 90s, I guess into the 2000s too, that Tony Schiavone got when he was the WCW commentator, because every week it was, this is the biggest Nitro in history, and tonight's the biggest main event I've ever seen. And you heard it 100 times a year. This is the biggest show ever. And it's like, well, then why should I care about what happened last week if it doesn't matter compared to how big and cool this show is?
Well, and here's the thing too. A lot of it's different today how wrestling is portrayed, because in my day we had the hour wrestling program, or hour and a half sometimes. Mm-hmm. But we all laugh about the fact that, Nick Bockwinkel would wrestle some jobber on TV. You knew the jobber wasn't going to win. Nick was getting a 2 or 3 minute workout in the ring. And then he comes out and he gives his interview. The interview, that 2-3 minute interview, that was the selling point. That was the thing. Or every once in a while, you'd work an angle on TV where two of the bigger names would get into a ruckus with one another, have some issue that would get the fans to go to the arena. But they didn't give the program away, the arena show. Now, today, and it's been this way for 40 years now, you can see high-profile confrontations on TV every Monday night for Raw and for SmackDown. And remind me to mention about SmackDown and Raw. You can see these high-profile confrontations, and they no more than get done with last night's pay-per-view or big program, and now they're pushing to, 2 weeks from now, we got this big one coming up. Mm-hmm. I think it maybe if it went back the way it used to be, I don't know. But like you say, everything can't be the greatest card. And again, it could be a cost factor for some folks. Not everybody can afford WWE doesn't do pay-per-views though, do they? Isn't it on the they call them premium live events PLEs, now, right? And it's on because what used to be their pay-per-view schedule streams through the Peacock app. Okay. Well, I remember when I was still kind of watching the pay-per-views and getting them, and I know me and a couple of other guys, we'd get together and we'd chip in to pay the $30 or whatever it was. Some of them were up to $50. I remember that. Mm-hmm. It was like a $50 cost, and I'm sitting there saying, what the hell do I want to pay $50 for? I just saw these guys all, and I was still a fan. Well, and it also, it mattered, when I was younger, and then I'm sure, you guys, when you were younger, it maybe on a busy year, you'd have a pay-per-view every other month. 4, 5, 6 shows. Now, I think at one point they said the WWE had something like, including Saudi Arabia, they had something like 17 pay-per-views in a calendar month, or a calendar year, excuse me. And it was like you said, there was points where it's like, the Raw after a pay-per-view
Michael Cole's already saying, 2 weeks from tomorrow, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah. And I think that's the whole thing. And again, this also goes back to the fact that there are people that are the diehards. We've got fans that'll tell you, I've watched it from 40 years when the explosion happened in December of '83 and wrestling changed. But then there are those that, I watched it for a couple years, or I remember when so-and-so was there, but it's a cyclical thing, even though it's on a bigger scale today.
Yeah.
But then bear in mind that we don't have as many wrestlers today. This has been a contention with me for years because everybody says, well, WWE, and just keeping them because they're the forefront here. Their production value is so good and the presentation is so good. Yeah, it is. But you know what? In our day, that isn't what we were interested in. We weren't interested in all the color, glimmer, and glats, and and the fireworks and the signs holding up and the music and all this other BS. We were interested in give us a wrestling card.
Wrestling.
Right.
And we literally, and guys, this will get old, but we had those 4 lights or 5 lights above the ring, a dark arena, the wrestlers on their stage wrestling. The ring didn't have any apron around it or anything. You could see all the way under the ring. We had the cement floor in the arena, no ropes around the ring. As a fan, I was, this far from the ring, sitting in my ringside seat, and they'd fall down on the floor in front of me and have a little ruckus, and whatever. But it was a different product. It was more personal art. And we had so many wrestlers. When we had 25 or 30 different territories that were running wrestling 365 days a year, because every town, every territory had their own night, as we pointed out a minute ago. You went to Tampa, Florida, every Tuesday night, you could go to the Armory. Every Monday night, you could go into Miami and go to their wrestling card. Tallahassee was one night. Fort Lauderdale was one night.
Yeah, West Palm, yeah.
West Palm Beach. So if you lived in Florida, you could do a little driving if you wanted to, but if you were a wrestler, you could work every night of the week in Florida. Didn't have to leave the state of Florida. You were in Houston every Friday night, except on Christmas Eve. If it fell on Friday night, which it will every, 5 or 6 years, it'll fall on. So on that particular time, if you look at, I can go pull my programs out, and you'll find that they didn't have a Friday night card. They had one on Sunday that week. The Sunday Spectacular or Sunday, matinee or whatever it was. That was the only night. Otherwise, Friday night. We used to do Saturday nights. And back in the 60s, I was just going through a bunch of St. Paul programs again here a couple weeks back. Oh man, St. Paul ran every single Tuesday. Actually, it was Friday. Every single Friday night for the entire 50s. Friday night was wrestling.
Wow.
And then they moved to Saturday, and eventually Minneapolis, they were running Tuesdays. We used to get 2 cards a week.
Man.
It was crazy. But we had a lot of wrestlers. And even though you only had 20, 30 wrestlers on a particular territory at the time, to keep it running, you got to remember every territory had 20 or 30 wrestlers. And you got 25 or 30 territories. And all these guys are making money. So
still crazy because you talk about it in the book, and Benny, we've had guys on talk about their days in the locker room. There was somewhere between 15 to 30 guys in the back, and you have like the WWE and AEW today have 40 to 60 people under contract that you see them, their name will come up on a match and it's like, oh, I forgot they still work there. Hasn't been on TV since August kind of thing.
But again, there is no place for those guys to go.
True. Yeah. With the indie, although I will say we've had some indie talent on the show, and Benny and I have talked about it where it's, I don't want to say easier. Obviously, anybody that's ever been anywhere near the business knows it's not easy to make a living in wrestling, but it's easier today than it was 10 years ago to make a living as the guy that, like you said, the guys and girls that travel $50 here, $50 there, because there are so many tiny feds, doing your Armory, high school gym, 50, 100 people in the crowd, 200 people in the crowd. than there were 10 years ago. Something about maybe it's the AEW factor, maybe the rise of things like Ring of Honor, but there's a lot more little indie feds than there used to be. And we've had some people tell us that they're having not as hard a time as the stories, of, like I said, 10, 20 years ago, of surviving without being in one of the big companies.
Yeah. Well, the key thing to all of those little indies, though, and we've got some good ones, and I encourage people, I say go support them versus supporting Vince McMahon and making him rich. Well, even if he's not involved, I don't even know the story with him. I don't really care anymore. But he's a billionaire. God bless him. He's a marketing man. He's a genius. Give him his A's on all those things. But he's also a jerk. So, if you can live with yourself with that, good. Then you're all right.
Right.
Our little independence. The key thing is, like anything else, TV. TV has always been, since 1948 when it came into vogue or started coming into vogue. TV has been the reason that wrestling was on the rise, and wrestling became popular and became an in-demand and the worldwide thing it is. And any promoter would tell you, if you don't have TV, you're not going to be able to have a promotion. You can run a card, but your word of mouth is not enough. And hanging a poster on a I was going to say a telephone pole. I don't even think they have them anymore. Or in a store window or whatever it was, that's not going to get enough people. You had to have TV. And when you look back go back 40 years now, when all these television outlets had their local wrestling programs on, those promotions were thriving because of that.
Right.
When Vince McMahon came in, started buying up the TV times that the other promoters had, paying television stations to not run their program, and even going into the arenas and saying, I'll put on my show, do this, that, and the other thing, and you don't rent to Vern Gagne or whoever. When you're doing that kind of stuff, you can't get on TV, you're not going to have a success. And that's what happened with a lot of the original breakdown of the territories. You could say, well, that's the way the business went and it's the way it is, and good or bad business, but it's dirty pool because there was enough for everybody. But the bottom line is, we know that as the world has evolved with technology as it is, that when did cable come in? About the end of the 70s, cable started to be coming in some territories.
Really took off in the 80s, yeah.
So you had 30 years from the time television was on a little tiny postage stamp machine that was cool in the day.
Right.
And then it grew and grew, and it was in all the areas of the country. And before you know it, people had TVs. But it was going to happen that eventually, and the experiment, a lot of people don't think about this, but the experiment started to happen with wrestling as far back as 1976, when Vince McMahon Sr. put on the Antonio Inoki and Muhammad Ali mixed martial match, mixed martial arts match. And then they had Chuck Wepner, the Bayonne Bleeder. Wepner, wasn't it? Against Andre. And then in each of the individual territories, we would have a closed circuit match that they put on. So Vern put on his show from Chicago, and it was a main event show, but it was shown to us in St. Paul, but via closed circuit. That was the first part. That was your hint that things were going to change. By the time we got to 83, it had been advanced enough with cable. Kayfabe was breaking down because I could watch All-Star Wrestling, and I'm getting the Superstation out of Atlanta in my Twin City market. They're telling me that Jim Brunzell is injured and he's down there wrestling, holding their title. And we're getting it on TV. Or they told us Bobby Heenan has been suspended from wrestling. He's down there managing for a year in Atlanta, managing Mass Superstar Jack Lanza, and I think he had Killer Carl Cox with him or something. Heenan's, because he went to work for Ole Anderson for a little bit. Right. So I almost said Rock Rogowski. Because that's Ole. That's it. Yeah. But that's when it started to break down. somebody was eventually going to do what Vince McMahon did. And Vince, I think he succeeded, number one, because of youth. He was 33, give or take, years old in 1983, 84. And all of these other name promoters that had been around for 20, 30, 40 years, they were all in their 50s and 60s. They had their vision was tunnel. Their product wasn't broken. Their product was working well. They're not going to change it. And Vince McMahon had the idea. Give him credit for that. I don't agree with most of what he did, but
right.
I think if I would have been him and I had the money, I might have done the same thing. I mean, why wouldn't you?
No. How's the old saying? If not him, someone.
Someone. And there were other people that kind of thought about it, but again, their mindset was, this isn't broken. We're not going to fix it.
Yeah.
And with if you would have been around, I don't think you guys were around 40 years ago, were you?
I was.
Benny, you were.
I was 28.
I'm exactly 40, so that's kind
all right. So, but I go back to 40 years and just say 35, 40 years ago, the promotional wars as they were going on, I was intrigued with it. I loved it. I honestly, though, I will tell you, I was one that when WrestleMania 1 came out in 1985, my wife would tell you, I said to her, this is a one-shot deal. He's never going to be able to pull this off. Well, so much what I know. What are we now? WrestleMania 900 now coming up?
WrestleMania 40 is what's coming up next year.
40, yeah.
Again, here we find ourselves, George. So much more to talk about as we run out of time, as we're getting ready to wrap up.
We don't have time for the last topic.
Well, that's what I wanted to say. I wanted to say, because it always comes up on our shows, and Benny, you had talked about it. We got to get your thoughts. We talked about baseball before we got to recording. I want to get your thoughts on one, just get more of a curiosity, your thoughts on the Shohei Ohtani contract. 10 years, $700 million, $68 million deferred each year for the next decade. But also, Benny, you had some final thoughts on ticket prices.
Well, yeah, and George will be with me on this. I went to a doubleheader at Yankee Stadium in 1970. It was a couple of months shy of my 15th birthday. I paid 75 cents to sit in the bleachers at Yankee Stadium to watch a doubleheader. Now, contrast that to last spring. I actually paid $50 to go to Steinbrenner Field in Tampa to watch a spring training game. I can only imagine how much it's going to cost to buy a ticket to a Dodger game this coming season. And on Saturday, I just for shits and giggles, I looked on Ticketmaster out of curiosity for wrestling. We just talked about WrestleMania 40. Their tickets selling for $5,000 each night, and just my opinion, I think this is insanity. And when does this end, or does it end?
You're asking $1 million question, and the thing is I ask that all the time. I said, when does it end? When do we reach the ceiling, or when is enough enough? The salary things, I've been around baseball long enough to know that back in the 60s when I watched the Minnesota Twins, and you could go to a game and it was we say it was relatively cheap. I always like to bear in mind that the ticket for the game in 1967 might have been $3 to get into the Metropolitan Stadium. But at the same time, the annual average income back then for a poor working stiff was $8,000 or $10,000 a year. Okay, so the ticket price was expensive at $3 or $4. It's all comparable in that sense. But I went to the 1991 Minnesota Twins World Series when they played against Atlanta.
Right.
And we had home field advantage. So we had the first 2 games at home, 3 on the road, 2 at home for the playoffs and for the series itself. And my buddy called me up. We said, well, if the Twins ever get to the World Series again, we should go. My friend calls me up and he says, well, I can get tickets. We're going to go. And of course, I'm thinking, I only work at a bank. I don't get to take home samples, and I don't know that I can afford. Well, you know what it was? Well, I could take home samples, but that's using the E word and embezzled, and then I'd be unemployed. But
future endeavor.
You know what it cost me? And as I do this, I'm looking up on the wall right in front of me here. I have them all framed. I have them in a frame. My playoff, my World Series tickets, and the team picture for the 91 World Series. For all 8 games, and you remember it went all 8 games, or 7 games I'm talking about. For all 14 games, it went the duration. How much do you think I paid for our tickets?
We're 8-game total?
8-game total.
I'm going to say $150.
All 8 games. And
150.
Well, it's a little bit more than that. It was $300.
Okay.
And trust me, in 1981, I got kids in private school. We got a house payment. We got a car payment. We got this. We got that. That was a lot of money, man.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, today, like you say, if I want to go to the World Series, well, you can go for $5,000.
Yeah.
Well, I got news for you. I'm not going.
That's one game.
Can't. One game. I was sitting in my office at work, and this would have been 1985, 86, right in there. I don't remember the baseball player who it was. The lady that sat next to me, we got into the baseball talk, and it was about whatever this guy was making at the time. His salary was posted, and boy, we had a heated discussion. And I told her, I said, anybody that gets paid that much money, they should be God. She says, what do you mean? I said, because they can't perform all the time. That's what bothered me. So now let's look at Ohtani. Okay. He had trouble last year, this previous year. He missed some of he's a DH and a pitcher, and right. he couldn't pitch, right? Towards the end.
And he won't pitch next year either.
He won't pitch next year. But here's the deal. Baseball, and we're just going to use that because I know the other sports could figure this out as well. Baseball is the only sport where a guy can get paid a huge, huge, huge salary, incomprehensible to the average stiff.
Yep.
I mean, I don't care what you say, $700 million. That I don't know how you do that. Now, but the key thing with a baseball player is, you guys know I'm right when I say the baseball player in a game, one game, you probably, if you're a hitter, you come to the plate 3, maybe 4 times.
4 times, right.
And in a rare time, it might be a 5th time if there were, one inning where they went around the horn and everything. But let's just say 4 times. So then you look at the screen and he's 0 for 3, coming to the plate number 4 time in the evening. He's 0 for 3 for the night. This is your guy that's making all the money. This is the big dog. This is the guy that, because he's making so much, he should be able to just hit the ball and it just goes out. Doesn't happen. And he can do this 3-4 games in a row.
Yeah.
Okay. And then all of a sudden he'll have that game where, oh boy, he broke out. He's got 2 hits. He's 3 for 3 tonight. And tomorrow night he hits a home run. And then he goes into a slump again. He's the one getting. So in baseball, you can be good, 33% of the time?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're a Hall of Famer then.
And you're a Hall of Famer.
Right.
So then you got the poor stiff who gets up every morning, 6 o'clock, drives to work, hour in traffic, works 40 hours, puts up with a jerk for a boss just to come home, feed his kids, and he makes a menial salary. And he's expected, he is expected to be 100% all day long, 40 hours a week. And when he screws up or doesn't perform 2 days in a row, you're called into the office. Hey, buddy, this isn't going to cut it. Either clean up or you're out of here.
Right.
See, and that's where I have a problem with the salaries. And then the other side of it is, I know, I'm not blaming the players, because if someone's going to offer it to you, of course you're going to take it. And if they're willing to pay it, whatever. I get all that. But you got a player and using Ohtani, if he's injured, you're still paying him. What good is he? You're talking a human being who can break, who can be sick, who can get broken, who can have injuries. and you're paying them a salary that they may not be able to perform. I don't understand that. Now, I know, and again, I tell people, this is just in my opinion. You think I'm nuts? Fine, I don't care. But if you paid baseball players, and again, we're just sticking with baseball because you could do this with other sports. If you paid a baseball player, let's just say you signed him to a contract and you paid him, say $1 million a year, just to keep the number simple. And then you say to him, if you want to earn 10 million, all right, here's what you're going to do. When the bases are loaded and you're at the plate and you're 0 for 3 and the bases are loaded, you better bring a couple of stiffs home. Okay, if you don't, you just got paid your normal million that you're going to earn. But every time you bring a run in or you get a double, a triple, baseball, they can do these statistics for everything these guys do. They can tell you how many times they took a dump before they came to the stadium. Right. They got all these figures, facts, stats. It's one of the craziest sports in the world. The announcers are sitting there and they're rattling stuff off the guys did. I mean, so let them earn what they earn, if that makes sense. So you're going to get paid $1 million. That's if you show up to the ballpark. If you go 6 games and you don't do nothing, fine. But when you perform, well, now you're going to go home tonight and holy crap, I made $1 million tonight because I just hit, brought 4 runs in, hit a home run. I don't know. I don't know if it would work, but with the way they do statistics, I think it would make more sense and the salaries would be more in sync. The other side of it is, we're going to pay that in ticket prices. We're going to pay for his salary, for the merchandise. We're going to have them, but they're going to sell it. They're going to make money. The ticket price. You can't go to a Twins game. I don't know what it is in New York, but you can't go to a Twins game now for under like $40-50. Just an average ticket. I just want to get into the ballpark. And I got to give you a kidney.
Yeah. And then unless you're in Atlanta, you're especially now with Ohtani prices, you're paying $15 for a soda and a beer. Like,
yeah.
But
we've got Byron Buxton for the Minnesota Twins.
Yep.
That's a sore spot with me. Here's my view of Byron Buxton. First of all, I think he's a nice guy. I think he's probably the salt of the earth. I think he's a good guy. He came to play for us, as a rookie. They brought him up. The first season they brought him up, they actually sent him down because he wasn't hitting at the major league level. All the stats, because they always tell you, well, it's a little bit different when you get to the majors. And adjustment and that sort of thing. So he was actually sent down. He came back up. When he came back up, he was injured. Now, I don't fault somebody for getting injured. We're in a contact sport. Your risk of injury is every moment you're playing. I get that. But he was injured and he was out. They were still paying him. The following year, he only played about a third of the year and he was injured. He's been with us 5 seasons. He has yet to play more than a half a season any of the 5 seasons. And he makes more money than anybody on the team as of this last year. He's getting paid to not play because he's injured. Why? So, if they want to do these contracts, I think what they need to do is, because you're dealing with humans, I think you need to say, yeah, we'll pay you $700 million. But if you're injured, you're only going to get the base salary and you'll be able to live a normal life until you come back.
Yeah, and that's the big thing, because baseball is pretty much 100% guaranteed unless you waive it or they have personnel clauses, you get arrested or whatever. Because they talked about with Ohtani, $700 million guaranteed. His contract has more guaranteed money than the largest guaranteed money contracts in the NHL, NFL, and basketball, NBA combined.
And how old is Ohtani?
29.
Yep.
All right. See, that's even goofier. I mean, and I'm you hate to use the term the armchair quarterback, but here's a guy who's 29, and yes, he's gifted. I mean, let's give it to him. A guy told me this past week, because we were talking about this. He says, you sound like you're jealous, George, because he's making all this money. I said, no, I'm not jealous at all. I'm just telling you, he's a human being and he can't perform. He says, well, there's only about 200 guys that can ever get into baseball that are going to do what he did. Okay, fine. But if he's injured, he can't do it. Here's a guy, 29 years old. Now, we know that as a baseball player, if you get close to 30 and a little bit after, well, your best days are behind you.
Right.
I mean, no matter who you are.
Albert
Pujols. You gotta, there's that small group that somehow they're 39 years old and they're still, somehow performing, and God bless them. But to give a guy 29 years old who's now been injured, and you don't know how strong or good he will be back when he is, and you give him a 10-year contract? What are you, delusional?
Right. Well, not just 10-year, but he deferred all but $2 million. He'll make $2 million a year from 24 through 33, and then 2034 through 2043 he'll get the Bobby Bonilla deal, but he'll be making $68 million. So imagine his game falls off. Let's say, I mean, I hope nothing but the best for him, but his game falls off 5-6 years from now. And 7, 8, 9 years from now, he retires or he's a shell of himself. He will have not played for 3-4 years with the Dodgers, and they're going to be cut. He'll be one of the highest paid players in the league still.
And then you started out by saying, where does the ceiling come in? When does this when does this end?
Well, the only way this ends, and we've talked about it on on various shows before, until Major League Baseball has a guaranteed salary cap, a hard salary cap, not this luxury tax BS. But either way, I digress. George, always a pleasure. I mean, between sports and wrestling and Minnesota, we just, I mean, it seems like we'll never run out of stuff to talk about. But again, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you on. Benny, closing thought to you?
No, it goes way too fast.
Always does.
It always does.
The fact that we've been talking for almost I apologize for some of our listeners, a long one tonight, almost an hour and a half, and it feels like we just started, Do
I get a hot dog? Do I get a hot dog?
I just want everybody to know that I'm not claiming to be a professional, factual person on baseball. I just offered some opinions. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter.
Views expressed by George Schire.
Yeah. We're strictly his own, and
right.
and the white coats are coming to get him.
Right. The view. How's that? The view of the guests, not expressed.
Not necessarily the opinion of Dan and Benny. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I agree with everything you said.
Absolutely.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. It's always fun.
Always a fun. Well, George, I mean, you got a lot of good stuff out there. All our listeners know, your books found anywhere books can be purchased. A lot of good stuff, especially like you said, the Golden Age Minnesota wrestling. For the playa himself, Benny Scala, for George Schire. Again, thank you so much for your time. I'm Dan Sebastian. Have a good night, everyone, and we will see you next time we're in the ring.